Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. I am your host, David Parsons. I am thankful that you're listening to the show, and I want to start today with a little bit of personal news that I think will probably affect the show, I hope in a positive way, and a lot of that will depend on what you do as a listener to the show in supporting the show on my Patreon, because I am quitting all my jobs in New York, all my mini academic jobs, pulling up stakes and moving back to California this summer after my wife has accepted a position at a school out there. So I am starting anew. I don't know what I'm going to be doing out there, actually. Maybe a little bit of research, hopefully some teaching. I may be moving into teaching high school, exploring that option. I have no idea, but I mean, the fact of the matter is I've had my PhD for a few years, teaching American history as a tenure track. Academic professor is a shrinking job pool, and by that the odds look impossible, despite the fact that I'm publishing books and doing all the stuff I'm supposed to be doing. It's just kind of like the fact of the academic job market. Either that, or maybe I just totally suck. But either way, I'm going to be unemployed this summer, and I'm going to be trying to put stuff together in the fall. And I want to, I want to bring the Nostalgia Trap with me. Obviously, the West Coast has tons of schools that I'm connected to. I went to UC Santa Barbara as an undergrad, and I know a ton of people in the UC system and other colleges out there. I plan on interviewing, all the radical Marxist academics that I know out there, and others as well, and getting to continue to do the Nostalgia Trap out there. But I do need support, and if I don't have support, I don't know how long I can keep the podcast going, because it costs money. I'm going to be I guess leasing a car and driving around LA and trying to do the podcast. I can't do that without support, especially if I don't have a regular academic job anymore. So if you do like the show, and if you do think it's important, which I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, but I feel like at a moment when politics are so fucked up in America, to have an outlet like this one, and I think there are others obviously that are growing this kind of like leftist podcast thing, but to have an outlet to be able to talk to older lefties and academic lefties and figure out what these ideas mean and bring them to wider audiences, I think that's a noble goal, and I think it's a useful one. So if you believe that too, please consider contributing to the show. It's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and you can donate, something like $5 a month. I have bonus episodes, mostly consisting of, so far, me and Claudia talking about books that we've read. Those are just for subscribers only, but we're going to have a lot more stuff. And I think I've sent out, a couple rounds of buttons and stickers for folks. If you have a Bernie would have won button, you're one of the subscribers already. So I'll have more of that stuff as long as I keep getting donations and the Patreon grows. I can keep growing the podcast. And I guess I just want to say that I really, really want to keep growing the podcast. So if you've enjoyed the program, please consider, if you can, donating a little bit of money to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And that's all I'll say on that. Thank you so much. I want to get to my guest today. My guest is someone, again, I've wanted to interview for a while. His name is Mike Koncewicz. I met him through a Cold War seminar that I was a part of with my GI Coffeehouse book, which is called Dangerous Grounds, by the way, available on Amazon and all other book outlets. But, I met Mike through NYU, where he is working as an archivist at Tamiment Library, which, for those of you that know the left, Tamiment has just an insane collection of underground newspapers and other kind of like ephemera from the left. So I talked to Mike about a lot about where he comes from, the typical Nostalgia Trap stuff, but also about his work on Nixon. He has a book coming out next year from University of California Press called "They Said No to Nixon: Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power," and it's really about those kind of like unknown names, those kind of bureaucrats that were either within the Nixon administration or within the government, the federal government at the time, who found ways to resist doing the sometimes unethical, sometimes illegal things that the administration was asking them to do. So we had a really great conversation about politics and how that all fits into a kind of larger framework of thinking about American politics. So I had a great time talking to Mike. I hope you enjoy this conversation. You can find more stuff, again, at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Consider donating to the show. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is me talking with Mike Koncewicz. I think of us both as, and I'm just totally guessing here, but like from suburban areas. But where are you from originally?
I'm originally from suburban Connecticut.
Suburban Connecticut.
Yes.
Oh, okay. What town?
But that's a pretty broad term.
Yeah.
Because, when people imagine Connecticut, they think of, Greenwich and Fairfield County and all these celebrities, who work in New York and live in Connecticut. But no, I grew up in New Britain and Plainville, Connecticut, kind of central Connecticut, right outside of Hartford. I guess lower middle class suburbs.
Yeah.
New Britain, it was a former kind of like industrial center.
Right.
That of course went to shit in the 70s.
Were you aware of that when you're like I
No.
think about all these like Rust Belt and like post-industrial, deindustrialized towns, and I was like, do the kids there know that they're like, because historians talk about that stuff a lot, the kind of like what's changed in these towns, and we can talk about like Michael Moore and Flint, Michigan,
Right.
but were you aware that the town was like post anything when you were growing up in it?
I mean, I guess not until like my teenage years, when we moved from New Britain to kind of like, I guess, the white flight suburb next door, Plainville.
Right.
Which is still not that wealthy. I mean, we maybe went from lower middle class to barely middle class.
Yeah.
But I did grow up in New Britain, just 2 blocks from housing projects. So a lot of my friends were kids from public housing.
Right. Well, what's the racial demographic of that town? Are there a lot of
New Britain, Connecticut.
it's like whites and blacks?
I don't know the exact percentage. Not too many blacks. Mostly Polish, like second, third generation Polish,
Right.
people, and that describes my family.
Right.
And then also a pretty large Puerto Rican community, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. Like through different parts of New England, especially in city centers, there are large pockets of Puerto Ricans.
That actually makes sense to me now
Yeah.
that I think about it, even though I've never thought about it before. That would be a group that would find its way into the towns of the Northeast that way.
Yeah, so I grew up around a lot of, looking back, now I can see that I grew up, in a pretty diverse community, especially on my block. I mean,
Yeah.
not only were there a lot of Puerto Rican kids, most of my friends were Puerto Rican in elementary school, but there was a big Laotian community. There's Cambodians, there were some Caribbean people.
Is that like refugees from the Vietnam War?
Some were.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these were second generation
That's
Laotian.
interesting because I know that you went to school in Orange County, which is
Yes.
which is another center of like where the refugees from the Vietnam
Yeah.
War end up in America.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So I grew up in Connecticut, lived in New Britain for about a decade, and then moved to Plainville, Connecticut, which is right next door. And like I said, that's a predominantly white community. And so I moved there when I was 14. And that's when I started to realize that a lot of my friends in Plainville, who are mostly white, were like, oh, wow, they don't, have much exposure to diversity. I know it sounds like I'm bragging, but it was just something that I realized,
Yep.
just in terms of kind of talking to people and seeing casual racism.
Well, that consciousness, it's come up on the show before of that consciousness of like, I don't know, being a white person. And then I wonder what it is that controls that like reaction, because obviously I was around tons of white kids the same age as me. And some of us were disturbed by racism. Yeah. And ultimately those are the kids that kind of made their way to the left.
Yeah.
And others that weren't disturbed by it or participated in it or were apathetic about it did not. And I just wonder what is it about you that you think that made you realize something? And you know what I mean? Did you see? For me, partly movies. I think I saw movies that made me sympathetic to the civil rights movement.
Oh yeah,
things like that.
When I lived in New Britain, the more diverse community, I would see racism, especially my grandparents, but these were older former factory workers, typical New Deal, my grandfather is a Polish immigrant, served in the Polish military, moved to the United States in the late 40s, early 50s. My grandmother is this Northern English person. She was the one that was very kind of loud about, not visually racist, but, kind of oh, they're the good ones,
Yeah.
She would use that type of language. So I would associate racism with being kind of a previous generation. And so when I moved to Plainville, this more kind of, middle class white suburb, I encountered racism among, people my age. And this kind of clashed with something I absorbed from popular culture.
And
and I don't know if this is something we share since we both look at the 60s and 70s. Like as a kid, I took the 60s very seriously.
And why is that?
And it's probably because my dad was born in the mid 50s. So, he was a teenager in the early 70s, kind of younger. So like, looking at his old records, looking at watching Beatles documentaries with him, movies about the 60s. I really bought that kind of monolithic narrative about the 60s that baby boomers were like really selling hard in the 80s and 90s.
This is like Todd Gitlin narrative.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That,
this was a special generation.
Oh, it was a special generation, and it was a special time. And I mean, we could talk about this later. I think in some instances, there's kind of this backlash to the 60s that goes too far.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
I really bought that hard, that something seriously changed in the 60s.
Me
the
too.
Country improved, and that the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement won. And like I said, they did, but what does winning mean? And when I was a kid, and it's even as a teenager, I really kind of romanticized that time period.
Me too, totally. It kind of connects to the '90s music, like grunge music. I mean, I feel like that was the grunge explosion of the early '90s with Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and all the so many others. I feel like was connected to the '60s. Like it was totally referencing the 60s, and now I realize how close it was to the 60s. It wasn't, I mean, it was 20 years later, basically.
Yeah, a lot of people focus, on Kurt Cobain, talking smack about, Rolling Stone magazine. You got that famous picture of a quote magazine still suck, but he was kind of generally the exception in terms of mainstream alternative rock grunge figures. I mean, now you look back at that, like, kind of Lollapalooza generation. Yeah. And it doesn't seem that far off from the 60s.
The Jane's Addiction at Lollapalooza in like 92 is like
they're
Woodstock.
Hippies.
Yeah, 100%.
And I remember as a kid, I mean, one of the most exciting things I saw was like Pearl Jam playing on the MTV Video Music Awards with Neil Young.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So
huge moment for me too.
And so it was really kind of.
Were you scared of him? Did you know who Neil Young was at that moment?
He looked weird.
He had giant like mutton chops, and I think he was just like completely wasted when he came out, and I thought this guy's like an old scary guy. Like now I don't think of Neil Young as old and scary at all. I mean, I know that he's a complete like drug zombie, but that was that entirely made me think, if Pearl Jam has this guy up here and they all think he's a god, obviously, then he must be important. I should find out who he is, and that led me to 60s music 100%.
Well, as a kid who was kind of listening to 60s and 70s music through my dad, like actually, looking back, I guess it was more comforting to see someone like Neil Young play with Pearl Jam.
That's funny. Yeah.
I mean, I was such a lame, nerdy kid. I remember watching the Smells Like Teen Spirit video when I was pretty young. I was 7 or 8 and being scared of it.
Yeah, totally.
I was like, well, who the hell is this guy?
Yeah.
And then so when I saw like kind of more classic rock based, alternative rock music, it was kind of comforting to see that kind of continuity.
Oh, back to this.
Yeah, where you see like Eddie Vedder vaguely looking like Jim Morrison.
Yep.
Holding a bottle of wine. He even had the Jim Morrison haircut, bringing on Neil Young.
That's right.
That was like, it was edgy and cool enough at the time, but it also reminded me of something I was already absorbing as a small child.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's funny. I didn't think of it that way, that like it would be a comfort to see the 60s and the 90s. So wait, where were we? We were talking about Connecticut.
Yeah.
And growing up there. What brought you to? Because I know you like eventually studied like presidential politics. Were you into like presidential politics at a young age?
Not in a
reading the newspaper and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, I was definitely aware of high politics, but
were your parents, did they talk politics around the house?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of my earliest memories is my dad, complaining about Reagan. I remember elementary school teachers being very excited when Bill Clinton won in '92.
Yeah.
Which, looking back on it hasn't aged quite well.
Right.
But I distinctly remember having this ruler where it listed all the presidents. Mm-hmm. And Bill Clinton was the last one. I remember buying it from the school store, and like for some reason I decided to like memorize that. Like it was like a baseball card or something.
Like memorize the all the presidents' names.
Yeah. And so I was doing
some kids do that.
Yeah. And so I was geeky enough to do that. And then the other thing was, once again, popular culture, like The Simpsons, which was kind of a good history lesson on like
totally.
Cold War history.
Yeah.
I became kind of aware of the presidents of the 20th century through that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I had my earliest memories of being fascinated by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon would pop up constantly
all
on
the time.
Simpsons,
Yeah.
later
And
on in
Futurama. That's right.
But even on The Simpsons, like, you know, I remember there's several episodes where he pops up and, you know, it's basically, you know, how the hell did this guy become president? You know, this ugly,
and you can tell the writers, and you can tell and paranoid psycho, and you can tell the writers of the Simpsons kind of grew up during that era.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's Bart's best friend is Milhouse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that was actually when I first was watching The Simpsons as a kid, and I noticed that name Milhouse. I think I looked it up, and I was like, I think that's. Where's that come from? And I think it must be Richard Nixon's middle name. That's why they did that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, especially on The Simpsons, because later on in Futurama, he's depicted as a villain, like a very powerful villain.
Yes.
Where
shoot him in the back.
Yeah. Whereas in The Simpsons, he's kind of the sad sack villain. I remember there's this one episode where it's one of the Treehouse episodes, the Halloween episodes.
Right. Those are the best.
Where Ned Flanders is playing Satan, and he has a jury of the damned, and one of them is Richard Nixon.
Nice. Yeah.
And he's basically like Ned Flanders is like, obedient slave.
Well, Nixon comes off as like a pathetic salesman a little bit.
Yeah.
Like a pathetic traveling salesman. And if you read like I don't know, the Rick Perlstein, the Nixon Land, he pretty much confirms that. Like it's kind of like this guy that has a lonely guy that never had a friend in the world that like basically created a brand.
Yeah.
That he formulated and like kind of worked the right people for years. I mean, he kind of like saw the 68 election coming for like 5 years before and started rebuilding his and you know a lot more about this than I do because I read Perlstein like 2 years ago. It stuck with me though.
Yeah.
But like what stuck with me the most about that book is like just Nixon's personality and how scary it is.
Yeah, so I remember as a kid, I mean, I wasn't a 10-year-old historian, but I remember just being fascinated by Nixon, this like sad sack loser who was also vaguely evil.
Yeah.
I knew he did something wrong. I knew there was a break-in to the Watergate Hotel.
Yep.
I remember seeing like Forrest Gump and there was kind
of
a reference to that. So this is all popular culture that's bubbling up in the early to mid 90s that's being put out largely by baby boomers who have Nixon as this cartoon villain. And then, so I remember in 6th grade, my parents put me in a Catholic school, largely because there were some incidents in New Britain at the time where kids were bringing knives to school, and so a lot of the parents who could afford to do so were scared.
Yeah,
so they put their kids. I remember there was a wave of kids going to like private schools in the mid 90s.
Hysteria about gangs and youth.
And actually,
violence,
there was real gang violence in New Britain, Connecticut, in the early mid 90s. I wasn't affected by it directly, but it was around, it was like just like a mile or two away. And so I go to this Catholic middle school, and I remember this is connected to Nixon because we had these dances. I remember it was a Halloween dance, and I for some reason thought it'd be funny to dress up as Richard Nixon. So I was 11 years old. I got like my dad's old suit, so it's just this baggy old suit.
Right.
And I found a Nixon mask at a Kmart for like $4.
You look like Point Break.
The
Robertson Point Break.
But for me, I remember seeing like the Point Break trailer. Yeah. But for me, I was like, hey, this is like a geeky Simpsons reference, and this will make my 5 other geeky friends laugh.
Right.
And so I show up and like, most of the kids are staring at me and they're like, who are you dressed up as? Because everyone else was dressed up as Bill Clinton at the time.
Right. Right.
But it made all the teachers laugh. And
he's their ghoul.
Yeah, and I won some sort of prize, and then for the final dance, this was like a tradition. The nuns always had "Stairway to Heaven" as the last dance because I think they thought it was like a pro-religion song. I don't think they knew that like Robert Plant was singing about like Lord of the Rings stuff.
Yeah. That's kind of incredible.
Yeah. So the last dance is "Stairway to Heaven." There's 7 minutes. It's a 7-minute song, and I got the courage to ask this one girl.
With your Nixon mask on?
With my Nixon mask, and she was dressed up as a hippie because a lot of the girls were dressed up as Jenny from Forrest Gump.
Wow.
And so it was me dressed up as Nixon dancing with
basically Jenny from Forrest Gump.
To "Stairway to Heaven," and this is in the mid 90s.
That's like that. You need to write a short story about that. That is what an incredible image.
Yeah, so I have a picture of like me and my sister. My sister has like a very traditional Halloween costume. She's dressed up as a witch, and then I'm dressed up as Nixon. And it's a very strange image. I show it to my students before I give my Nixon lecture to just show like how Nixon's image is always looming.
Yeah. I mean,
and they kind of look at this and they're like, wow, you're a big nerd.
That's awesome, dude. I admire you for that. When I was in AP U.S. History in high school, we had to dress up as a historical character, and I dressed up as Leon Czolgosz, the anarchist that assassinated McKinley. And I don't know why I brought his like letters to like Emma Goldman and stuff like that. And it's weird because I don't feel like I was into that stuff. I just thought that he was like some sort of. I remember reading the story of the assassination and thinking it was cool, but I had to like dress up. Like I had a gun like stuck in my arm that came out like Taxi Driver style, you know, like that's how he did it. He like apparently like acted like he had a broken arm, and he had basically a gun come out. And now I realize it was all that was like pre-Columbine.
Yeah, so you can do that.
You can't bring fake guns to school anymore.
No.
That idea of you in a Nixon mask dancing with a hippie girl is incredible, because hippies were like his ultimate enemy, right?
Yeah,
like hippies and black radicals. What is it? The quote from like Haldeman that came out recently. It was about the drug war.
No, it was John Ehrlichman.
It was Ehrlichman. Okay, yeah. That identified like black radicals and hippies as the. Well, it wasn't hip. They didn't use the word hippies. They more said like
subversives.
The white anti-war movement.
Yeah, I have to look back at that article that dug up that quote. I mean, not to get too into the weeds here, but Ehrlichman, among like Nixon's inner circle, he was probably the one who was the most bitter. He was the one that really did not talk to Nixon much. I think he felt, that he was thrown under the bus by Nixon.
Yeah.
So you have to factor that in. I think his quote is generally true.
Right.
But he had incentive to kind of hype it up in order to get himself in the media.
I figured there was a context to it. Because you don't usually hear that level of like, I don't know, like a kind of candid expression that way.
Haldeman was kind of more of the loyal soldier.
Yeah.
His anger at Nixon would bubble up here and there. But Ehrlichman, in his memoir, and even in the tape, some of the final conversations with Nixon, you could hear the sense of betrayal. That Nixon is not going to get punished, but he has to tell his family why he has to go to prison.
It makes you wonder about it must drive you crazy too, thinking about Trump, because people are so eager to like make these like do things that historians don't want to do, which is like, how is Trump like Nixon? And it seems like something that it's going to drive historians crazy.
Forward. Yeah, and I mean, I've had to deal with it a little bit because, I mean, as a Nixon historian, I think for the first time in my academic career, I'm getting some like limited media exposure. And it's because people want these Trump-Nixon comparisons. And some of them are valid, but as other historians have pointed out, Rick Perlstein, most recently Nicole Hemmer, who has a really good book on conservative media, we got to watch out, because I think in some ways people are taking comfort in the comparison to Watergate. Because in Watergate everything worked out.
Right.
I mean, in the short term, I guess that's true. Long term, that's a more complicated story. But I think people look at Watergate and they say, "Oh, the good guys won," and so eventually,
and the system worked.
And so eventually, that's going to happen with Trump.
Right.
It's almost inevitable.
I think that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah,
that's a good warning.
Yeah. What gets lost in that narrative is that, well, one, the Republican Party was very different back then. It wasn't as ideologically, conservative. It wasn't, but even with that more diverse Republican Party, it wasn't until the summer of '74 that large numbers of Republicans, really abandoned Nixon.
Which is way late in the story.
I mean, that's 2 years after the break-in. It's more than a year after Watergate becomes a national story, probably in about, early, maybe spring of 1973. So it takes a while, And also, of course, it was a more liberal political culture. Democrats were in control of Congress. So that's where you get these Nixon loyalists today, where they say Watergate was just a witch hunt against the president to reverse the 1972 election. And they'll point to these Democrats where there's some evidence that they were politicizing certain parts of the investigation. And, to a certain point, they have a point. But, this is all kind of tied into the fact that, there are serious differences back then, too.
Yeah.
And that's something I've tried to point out, when talking to a few radio hosts. And I recently wrote a piece in the LA Times, but it's an op-ed. You can only do so much in 800 words.
Yeah, right. Wait, so I missed that piece. I didn't see you had an op-ed in LA Times that basically said this. About Nixon. Was it about Nixon?
No, it looked at my dissertation research.
Okay.
My research. And we can talk about how I kind of ended up at this point. My research looks at Republicans in the Nixon administration who said no to Nixon.
Yeah.
So people who refused to carry out illegal or unethical orders. So the most famous is Elliot Richardson and the Saturday Night Massacre. And that's the one that everyone's been seizing on because there are very kind of simplistic parallels between Nixon's decision to fire James Comey and Elliot Richardson's refusal to go along with the firing of Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor. But there's also these other stories, people within the IRS, who refused to audit political enemies. The infamous enemies list was actually never fully instituted because of Republicans saying no. And that's something that gets lost in the narrative of Watergate, and there were people within the OMB, once again, Republicans who said no to Nixon in terms of trying to punish MIT. Nixon was determined to try to take federal funding away from MIT, take defense grants from MIT and other elite universities. MIT would be the starting point for this project. But there were Republicans who said no to that. So weirdly, Nixon was on the same side as anti-war protesters in getting the military off their campuses.
That's really interesting.
But for different reasons, And so in the LA Times, with a piece that I recently wrote, it was basically after some editing, it came down to, here are the people in the Republican Party said no to Nixon. Are those people here today? What kind of got
and
lost?
Who would they be, and how visible are they?
Because right now all we have is John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who are described as moderates, even though they're these viciously hawkish conservatives. But because culturally they're at odds with Trump, they're depicted as moderates because they'll tisk Trump whenever he says something stupid.
The worst.
Whereas back then, you can actually point to some people who actually have some ethics who resisted Nixon's worst instincts.
And you're not talking about people necessarily. I mean, I could be wrong, but it sounds like you're not talking about people that are like the tank guy standing in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square that are kind of like making this big kind of public break with the president. You're talking about people that are like unknown people that kind of that use their power to, in whatever way, stop or not carry out the orders of the administration.
Well, yeah, they're either unknown at the time.
Right.
Some of them become more famous. Paul O'Neill is one. He was assistant director of the OMB. Later on, he became more famous as the Secretary of the Treasury under Bush. And he kind of resisted some of Bush's more conservative, projects at that time.
Interesting.
So some of them are unknown. Some of them are very well known, but they did their best to keep their disagreements with Nixon private. Right. George Shultz is one of these guys. Reagan's Secretary of State, but at the time he was a cabinet member for Nixon. He was constantly protecting people, from Nixon's, abuses of power, both in the IRS and in the OMB. He was someone who kind of knew how to work the system. You listen to the tapes, he's very polite to Nixon, but there's this tension there because Nixon knows he's from like high academia.
Right,
he went to MIT, and they never talk about these things that they're disagreeing with behind the scenes. And so he's the one that's standing up to Haldeman and standing up to Nixon's inner circle when it comes to these various plans to politicize the IRS or the OMB. So he's another one. And then even someone like Elliot Richardson, who becomes very famous. He's kind of not only the most famous example of standing up to Nixon, he's kind of emblematic of this establishment, moderate, Republican. People on the left would describe him as someone who's like part of the deep state. Right. But he's also incredibly boring. And he has no, and he has no like at the time no interest in like having this public fight with Nixon.
That's what it sounded like. It's like these aren't crusaders.
No, these are
people like there's something deeper that's motivating them.
Yeah, and so like I said, I've presented my research to people further to the left than me, and they said, well, these people are more loyal to the deep state than Nixon, and so that's why they're doing that. And they're like, yeah, I guess there's a point there, but these people actually are born out of this post-war technocratic culture that are taking like nonpartisan civil service very seriously. Now, once again, you could be cynical and say, well, they're not adopting that when Nixon's invading Cambodia. A lot of these people, including Elliot Richardson, even though behind the scenes he's not happy about it, publicly he goes along with Nixon. Right. But I think it's very interesting that you see breaks with the president, even before Nixon becomes this pariah by 73 and 74. And so,
is it the criminality that's basically the line that a lot of these people aren't willing to cross?
Yeah. And so that's the argument I'm making, is that even before Watergate becomes a national issue, you could see they're either moderates or they're moderates in terms of their approach to civil service.
Right.
And so when Nixon starts to micromanage the criminality that used to be fully instituted by the FBI, because Hoover by 70, even before his death, in 71, he kind of comes to the conclusion that, and historians have written about this, Tim Weiner does a great job of this. Hoover decides that he can no longer be Hoover. That the left is starting to kind of raise consciousness about, not necessarily COINTEL, that doesn't come out till years later, but about, what the FBI is doing.
I want to hear more about
that. And so Hoover tells Nixon that he's not going to go along.
Like they're onto us, kind of?
Kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glossing over a lot of details here just for the sake of time. But Hoover is telling Nixon in 70 and 71, we can no longer be as aggressive, or we can't take that next step against the left.
Yeah.
They're it's not to overlook the fact that there's tons of shady stuff going on.
Yeah.
But the Nixon White House talks to the FBI and they say, we want to, increase the level of moderating left-wing groups. And Hoover actually shoots down that plan. That's something called the Houston Plan. And so that also explains why Nixon combined that with the release of the Pentagon Papers in June of 71. You take those two things together, and that's why Nixon brings all of those crimes that used to kind of be spread out throughout the FBI and other parts of the federal government
into the executive.
And he brings it into the executive office.
What a story.
And so once again, I've encountered, people on the left that I'm friends with who say, well, what difference does that make? I would say that is different, and that's what makes Nixon.
It brings the fascism into the executive, and into a much more kind of politically powerful place.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Nixon exceptional.
Yeah,
even in 2017. I mean, we'll see what happens with Trump, but that's what makes him different.
Yeah,
when we're looking at other presidents in the post-Watergate era, whether it's Reagan or Clinton or Bush or or even Obama, if Nixon's kind of micromanaging of kind of what he was trying to create, a new national security state within the White House.
Yeah, right.
Makes it different.
Yeah.
And it makes it less accountable.
And the level of criminality is crazy. I mean, I think that's one thing that I never understood, and I'm assuming most Americans don't understand. They hear about this Watergate thing, and most Americans think of it in the popular imagination. It is Forrest Gump. Yeah. It was this little break-in where some people took some files. Who gives a shit? But if you read about what Watergate represents, Watergate was part of something much, much bigger. I mean, what you're describing here, which is this essentially criminal enterprise to. They call them rat fucks, but but basically to destroy the competition, and to secure Nixon's absolute power.
Yeah, and it's not just rat fucking Democratic primary candidates, like Ed Muskie, who was seen as the front runner,
who they sent his plane to different places. They recently, they sent faxes and fucked with his schedule all the time, little things like that.
Oh, and actually, because this is something that's often. See, one of the narratives about Watergate that kind of bothers me and several other Nixon historians is that Watergate is just this break-in that was done by these crazy guys like G. Gordon Liddy, who were just kind of sloppy
and got a blade between their teeth, in the air conditioning ducts.
And you see this both on the right and the left in terms of comparing either Hillary Clinton or Trump to Nixon, or they'll say, Nixon had to resign because of a break-in. And even if they think that was wrong, that Nixon's guys broke into the Watergate Hotel, it pales in comparison to Donald Trump's crimes or Hillary Clinton's crimes.
Yeah.
And like you said,
does it though? Yeah.
I mean,
we don't even know.
Well, with Trump, we don't really know.
It's weird to make a judgment like that
even with Hillary Clinton, we don't really know. I mean, we're not going to know for decades from now. And so if you listen to the tapes and you look at, even textual records, you could see that Nixon, not with the illegal break-ins, because he's smart enough to keep some distance.
Right.
He's micromanaging this.
Yeah.
During the Democratic primaries, or in the build-up to the Democratic primaries, there's evidence that shows that Nixon he himself is suggesting that they send out fake mailers in New Hampshire to encourage people to write in Ted Kennedy's name.
Wow.
To take votes away from
yeah.
Ed Muskie, and other Democratic candidates who actually have a shot at winning a nomination. This is the president of the United States who's coming up with this plan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the more striking things that stuck out to me about the Nixon story is when George Wallace is shot.
Yeah.
And when George Wallace is shot, Nixon himself goes into a complete panic.
Yeah.
And it's like, we have to make sure that this doesn't come back to us, because there's actually a moment that it seems like Nixon and his team think this might be us. Like, this might be one of the projects we started.
Yeah.
That and we find out who this guy is. And their plan was to go to the apartment of the dude that shot Wallace and like basically throw left-wing literature all over his house. And I tell my students this shit, like they're just like, "What? Like the president was doing things like that?" And you're like, "Yeah." That's like, it sounds like a movie.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what kind of captured the imagination of people about Watergate. But either way, the idea that like the president is, first of all, when another candidate for president is shot, he's not clear of whether or not his team had anything to do with it. And then his second thought is we have to cover this up.
Yes,
it tells you a lot about his character, like right off the get go. Good Lord.
Yeah, and that's taking place. I mean, I'm a bit sleep deprived, so my memory is a little foggy. But I think that's happening in May of 1972.
Right.
Which is a very intense time period because, as you know, as a historian of the anti-war movement, the anti-war movement kind of picks up steam every spring.
Yep.
Whenever there's a new offensive.
Right.
And so in the spring of 72, you have the Haiphong Harbor bombings, and Nixon that's like one of several periods where Nixon is just nuts, and so he's especially paranoid that spring, and so the Wallace thing happens while he's already kind of raging against the anti-war movement,
right? And for those that don't know, Wallace, the guy that shot Wallace, was just like a guy that was like literally just a psycho that like wanted fame. He was like a very typical kind of,
which is usually the case,
Travis Bickle type figure,
and so what gets lost when remembering Nixon. And this is especially true of baby boomer scholars, and it kind of starts in the late 80s and 90s, is just how exceptional Nixon was in terms of the criminality of his administration. And so the argument I make to everyone, but especially when I'm engaging with kind of left-wing scholars or activists who are saying, why is Nixon any different from other imperial presidents,
right?
Especially in the post-war era,
right?
I would say this matters, and
I agree.
And so you can,
and also matters for what comes after.
Exactly.
It's not just. I mean, I think you make the case that Nixon is an exceptional president, and for this reason. I mean, and this is what makes him exceptional. But it's also, he kind of dragged us into a darker place generally, and I know that's kind of like a pretty well-established narrative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and Perlstein's the most popular historian to kind of.
Right,
but it's true.
Yeah,
I mean, Roger Stone has that new Netflix documentary. That's the link. You know, I mean, he's only one guy, but he's a part of that culture.
Yeah,
and so my research kind of, and I'm lucky enough where I'm going to be turning this into a book in the next year or two,
which is called
"They Said No to Nixon."
Nice.
Republicans who stood up to the president's abuses of power. But my research looks at the fact that these moderate technocrats, these boring guys embedded within the final stages of the New Deal, state, are resisting this new culture of criminality that's becoming more prevalent in Republican Party politics, and it's not always aligned with the new right, but it's often aligned with the new right.
Right.
This is something that gets overlooked because I think people want to give the new right and the conservative movement in the last 50 to 60 years a fair shake, but if you look at what's Nixon's relationship to the new right is a lot of conservatives they're the ones that are the most fiercely loyal to Nixon. And there's a famous quote that's been highlighted by Perlstein and others by M. Stanton Evans. He said, "I didn't like Richard Nixon until Watergate." Because Nixon throughout his presidency is co-opting these liberal programs. He creates the EPA. He's doing it because of a Democratic Congress. And what people overlook is that if you listen to the tapes, he wanted to scale back a lot of those liberal programs. And so that's upsetting a lot of conservatives. Buckley hates him because he goes to China.
Right.
Buckley is actually brought to China, and he's disgusted by what he's saying.
Wow.
But then Watergate happens, and Nixon's approval rating is down to 25%. But that 25% is made up of a lot of hardcore conservatives who see him as a martyr.
Yeah.
They see him as a martyr for the cause.
And that kernel seems like it's grown.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
In America.
I mean, Nixon is not Reagan. There's not as many people who are willing to go to bat for Nixon as Reagan, but the people who are willing to go to bat for Nixon are fiercely loyal to the idea of Nixon.
Yeah.
The guy who was president during the peak of the New Left, during the peak of black militants.
Yep.
And so he was the guy that was the law and order candidate.
Yeah.
And of course, this is where you get the real connection to Trump. It's not any kind of specific comparisons in terms of their personalities or even their politics, but it's this kind of vague culture of law and order.
Yeah.
That's always been a part of American history, but it's exceptional in Nixon and it's exceptional in Trump.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it has something to do with kind of an underlying attitude in American culture and politics that's been growing for a long time, and it's weird because it's like we are both we're both historians of the 1960s 70s era, and so in part we're biased and our kind of the things we stress about history are shaded by that. But at the same time, I mean, would you agree that it feels very much that we're living in the shadow of that era of the 60s and 70s? The politics that were created out of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement are still very much at the center of American politics.
I mean, we're living in the shadow of every era.
Yeah. We're living in the shadow of slavery, right?
But Donald Trump is a 70-year-old man.
Yeah, right. They're still in boomers that are controlling things.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean,
Hillary was a boomer. Is a boomer. Sorry.
I mean, granted, we had the first Gen X president in Obama, but
that's right.
Our lives have been shaped by boomer presidents.
Yeah.
Whether it's Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Donald Trump, or even people who weren't presidents like Hillary Clinton or John Kerry. Our political culture is still deeply shaped, not completely, but deeply shaped by baby boomers.
Yeah.
And so, of course, it's going to be shaped by the politics of the 1960s and 70s, and it will continue for better or for worse. Right now, mostly for worse.
Yeah.
It'll continue to do so for the next probably 10 or 20 years until these people start to die off.
Oh, God. Looking so forward to that. So I wanted to go back because we didn't do the nostalgia trap enough. I need to know, like, you went to UC Irvine, is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up in Central Connecticut. As a high school student, I got decent grades, but not. I was kind of not very ambitious student. I mostly got B pluses, and so I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went to the local commuter state school, Central Connecticut State.
Right.
And it's through there that I really got turned on to academia. I had some great professors there. And also I got involved in anti-war activism. My freshman year was 2002, so it was a year after 9/11.
So were you studying history there?
Yeah, so within a semester or two, I think it was by my second semester, I declared myself as a history major. And everyone was into U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Yeah.
That was the big thing.
Of course.
And so I had a great poli-sci professor who was a part of this honors program that was a part of a Central Connecticut State.
Right.
And, really kind of radical Lebanese, professor who presented a different take, kind of very Noam Chomsky approach to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And so that's when I started, really delving into, critiques of U.S. foreign policy.
Did you know about Noam Chomsky before that?
Yeah, I was vaguely,
as
a high school student, I was vaguely aware of him. I read some Zinn, and so I knew Chomsky was kind of like, I guess, the next step in my mind.
Yeah, it is the next step. Like Zinn's like the gateway to Chomsky.
Yeah, Zinn is easier to read.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Zinn I was reading in high school because I read some interview where Eddie Vedder said, you got to read Howard Zinn.
Yeah, and so it's either that or it's funny. It's either Eddie Vedder saying that, which I remember, but also Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting says something like. If you want to know about history, you read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States.
During that Gordon Wood scene.
Yes, and Robin Williams says something along the lines also of have you ever read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky?
Yes.
And I remember those sticking out as I was watching that movie at 19 or something, that maybe I should know those names. I mean, so it sounds like in high school you had some idea of what the left was.
Yeah.
I think a big leap for people, I think, is understanding that the left is not liberals. Right?
Yeah.
There's something else beyond being liberal.
Well, I didn't realize that till college.
Yeah, me neither. I don't know if I had realized that till graduate school.
I guess I kind of realized that. In 2000, I got really turned on to the Ralph Nader campaign.
Okay.
And the Green Party. I remember I got because some of the bands I liked, including Pearl Jam and others, like were openly advocating for Ralph Nader
in 2000, right?
Yeah, and so was Michael Moore.
Yep.
And I remember reading about this on the internet. This was shortly after the WTO riots.
Battle in Seattle.
Yeah, and I didn't, as a 15, 16-year-old, I didn't really understand what globalization was, but I was like, oh, this seems bad.
Yep.
And so I kind of was getting a sense of the left then, but it really wasn't until college when I started getting involved in student activism that I started to see a difference between liberals and the left.
When you say student activism, are you talking about anti-war activism specifically?
So post 9/11 anti-war activism. At Central Connecticut State, we had this group called the Progressive Student Alliance, and just by the very name, you could tell it was kind of this mishmash of liberals, anarchists, communists, people like myself who were trying to figure out what the hell they were, social democrats, and a lot of just college kids.
Right.
It wasn't Yale, it wasn't Wesleyan. It was a state school that wasn't afforded the opportunity of having these different cliques. So everyone just kind of came together for this 3 or 4 year period.
That's funny.
And so
there's literally there's not enough anarchists for an anarchist club. So we'll just all be a part of the Progressive Students
Progressive Student Alliance. And funny. So like I said, the anti-war movement was a way to kind of bring together all these students.
Yeah.
And so I remember when I joined, someone who wasn't really kind of thinking in a very kind of sectarian way. I saw all these older activists. I mean, they were only 21 or 22, but as an 18-year-old, I saw them, and they were more defined. They were like, I'm a Marxist, I'm an anarchist.
They knew who they were.
Yeah, and so it was alongside the pretty cool education I was already getting at this school. This was like a supplement to that. Because they were giving me a lot of literature to read. I remember going to Marxist reading groups for like a short period of time, and seeing like these old films about the Russian Revolution.
Wow.
With like this Marxist art professor.
Yeah.
Really radical guy and a great guy who just recently retired at Central Connecticut State. His name's Mike Alowitz.
Probably a boomer?
Yeah, more or less. But, not...
I think I might be friends with him on Facebook.
Probably.
He posts a lot of labor stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so he was kind of the club advisor for a year or two until, the anarchists kind of forced him out.
Yeah.
So I was exposed to all this, and even though I didn't always agree with it, it was a real education. By the end of college, I kind of decided, I was not this well-defined, full-blown Marxist, and I'm still not, but I'm just I'm being someone who's on the left.
Yeah.
It was really cool to see the stuff, even if it would freak me out sometimes.
Yeah.
Because you go from just watching Michael Moore films to then watching these films about the Russian Revolution.
Right.
And it almost feels like you're watching pornography.
Yeah, no, totally. This is shit you're not supposed to look at.
Yeah.
And that feeling of I don't know, I hesitate to say hip or cool, because it really isn't hip or cool. And you go to Marxist meetings, it's not hip or cool usually. But there was the idea that there was something dangerous about it, or that there was something that, even if I didn't buy the politics of whatever groups I was encountering in college and after, I felt like I needed to know about them. You know what I mean? It just made me aware. It made me feel dumb a lot of times. I should know more about this. Even if I reject it, I should at least know what Marxism is and be able to describe it.
Yeah. And so the role I kind of played in this little anti-war group eventually, by the time I kind of stopped being as shy as I was those first couple years, where we would have these debates between anarchists and communists about consensus and all this annoying kind of stuff.
Pre-twinkle fingers, but heading that way.
Yeah. And I would, more often than not, as someone who kind of respects structure and just getting things done, I would often agree with the Trotskyists in the group, the communists in the group.
Well, that makes sense considering what you study, because you end up studying these what you call boring bureaucrats.
Yeah,
but
it does.
I think for a long time when I first got into radicalism and the left, I looked at the guy. The guy standing up against the tank, and these kind of radicals that these heroes, the Stokely Carmichaels, the outspoken people. The people that the bomb throwers, even the Weather Underground. I thought when I saw a documentary on the Weather Underground, I was there's some people that actually fucking did some shit. You have to be radical in this country. But then as I've gotten older, and this is something I didn't anticipate maybe, but it makes sense that as I got older, I began to have more respect for these boring bureaucrats, thinking well, these are the people that actually get things done. And for instance, very recently when Trump did the travel ban, And people were like, what the fuck are we going to do? Like, to me, the heroes were like these lawyers who like went to the airport and helped people that were being detained there. And I was like, well, there's people that are actually like they're in a position to do something and are like, they're boring lawyers that are going to show up and actually have the power to make change.
Yeah.
And that ends up being important to me. Yeah.
And more often than not, they're either not completely, defined ideologically.
Right.
Or if they are, they don't care. They don't really publicize it.
Right.
They see that as secondary to getting things done.
Yep.
And so I think, granted, this is a very small story because it's just like some random student anti-war group.
Sure.
But like by junior, senior year, and also we were able to benefit from the fact that people were turning against Bush in 2005 or 6. Like in 2003,
right.
we had a lot of students screaming at us when we would be sitting at our little table in the student center.
God, it makes me wonder, like, would that happen if a 9/11 event happened right now? Would students be screaming defending Trump against the anti-war movement?
I mean, it was happening on a relatively liberal campus. I mean, this was not
I had liberal friends tell me that I needed to like shut up at criticizing the president because and it shocked me. Honestly, shocked me.
Well, I mean, people often forget just how emotional that time period was after 9/11, where you had even like liberals or middle of the road people who were just like, no, you cannot resist going to war in Iraq because we're still in this post 9/11 kind of anger mode.
Well, I mean, even Michael Moore at the Oscars, I showed that clip to my students and they're like, wow, because Michael Moore comes out and he doesn't say anything that radical. He says like, we say no to this war, we say no to the fiction of duct tape and orange alerts, and that's basically all he says. And like the crowd, like you can hear them, they're booing, like they're pissed.
And not only are people booing, but there's people in the audience, some pretty well-known Hollywood actors who are just kind of giving a look, kind of like, oh, he shouldn't be saying this right now because we just started the war a few days before.
Right.
I remember Susan Sarandon did kind of like some lame peace sign.
Right.
And that was it.
That's it. Yeah.
And so that was a real time of intimidation.
Totally.
And I mean, I just remember like getting yelled at by some, pretty actual macho bros, not bros in the 2016 sense,
right.
but real bros, who were just like,
that's what's aggravating about this bro thing. I'm like, dude, I've seen some real bros, and, and if you're saying that they are located in the Bernie Sanders camp, that's absurd.
These are not like
we have different ideas of what a bro is.
Yeah, these are not guys on Twitter arguing about David Foster Wallace. These are guys who are just pissed that you were saying no to George Bush. And so that was really happening in 2003. By 2005 or 6, I kind of fell into the role of this group because I wasn't like this like person who declared themselves as either an anarchist or communist. I just kind of tried my best to get along with everyone to get stuff done. And so we were able to do some decent work. We had like a student walkout where we had like 500 kids walk out of class. And for a commuter school, this was a big deal.
Yeah, really.
And like I said, we benefited from the fact that this was 2006. People were turning against Bush. It's after Katrina.
Sure.
And so we had some really cool moments there. And so I think the best moments in that group were where we were able kind of to just focus on getting stuff done instead of just reenacting the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, right. And also just like I don't know, when I see this in the stuff I wrote about with the GI coffee houses, is like the most successful moments of the GI movement were when they were able to like kind of drop those arguments about what we should do and kind of just focus on the things that united them and focus like on the very, like, for instance, one of the most like successful movements in the GI movement was about free speech, and it was just about like and the question was literally, do GIs have the right, do active duty soldiers have the right to speak about war? And like that question united everybody.
Yeah, and they're not getting into these debates about if the idea of free speech is a bourgeois value.
Right. Which is
they're just like, hey, free speech is a popular thing.
Yep.
This is something that people can agree on. Let's work on it.
Let's work on that. Well, I mean, these coffee houses, like when they tried to turn into like Marxist centers, Marxist like indoctrination centers, they just like nobody showed up. It was horrible. But when they had like bands playing and like just underground newspapers and a kind of slightly more casual attitude towards the politics, it like built. It got bigger. And there are lessons there. So wait, then how do you? So it sounds like you're in the anti-war movement, or you're involved in this student thing in Connecticut. But then how do you get to California?
Well, for 2 years, I tried out graduate school to see if I liked it. So I went to an MA program at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, kind of this little lefty bubble.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of dropped out of activism. It was a combination of just graduate school taking up too much time, and then there were just too many sectarian groups up there. Right. So it kind of turned me off. I remember sitting in one meeting at UMass where people were having a debate about using deodorant.
Wow.
And so I was like, all right,
I'm done.
I don't have time with this.
Yeah.
It's time for this.
Was Christian Appy there when you were there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and he was my MA advisor.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and he was great. And so that's when I started to study the anti-war press in the 1960s.
Sure.
And I carried that into UC Irvine for the first couple years of my time at Irvine, where I worked with John Wiener, a New Left historian who is most famous for getting John Lennon's FBI files released.
Right.
And so my initial dissertation topic looked at the anti-war press, but specifically focusing on the early period. Because I thought in that early period from 1964 to 1968, that's where you could see the war kind of bridging these cultural and ideological gaps within the left.
Right,
the old and new left.
Yep.
It's within the anti-war movement where you see these old Marxists hanging out with the new left. And they don't always agree about everything. They're listening to different music, but they're focusing on opposing the war in Vietnam. Yeah. And they're focusing on adopting a radical analysis of American foreign policy.
Right. And like seeing the war as connected to the bigger economic issues that their politics is about.
So whether it's these new underground newspapers like the Los Angeles Free Press or the East Village Other, you're familiar with these publications, or older publications like the National Guardian, which was kind of born in the 40s, but it still exists in the 60s. There's this period for 3 or 4 years where you see kind of ideological diversity within these leftist publications, but they come together to focus on the Vietnam War. Yeah. And so I think that's an exciting period, because the later 68 gets a lot of attention because that's where everything blows up, and that's where when a lot of these groups, not all the groups, but a lot of these groups start to argue with each other. Yep.
That's when SDS starts to break apart. Right?
Yeah. And so my initial research focused on this time period because it was kind of like a counter to this overemphasis on SDS as being the center of 1960s history. And your research, of course, on anti-war GI coffee houses at a later period also offers up a counter.
Right.
To that.
SDS is long gone, but there's a lot of left anti-war stuff.
National SDS is long gone.
Right.
But SDS, that's another thing. SDS continues to exist on college campuses in 71, 72, and 73. And it means something to kids outside of Madison and New York and 100%.
Berkeley. And it's a different crowd. I mean, they're a younger crowd, I guess, and they're a crowd of. It's interesting because it's like you have that early SDS group, and Todd Gitlin, who already came up, they're very much centered in this history, and it's a very really interesting and more. I feel like the left gets more local after 68. Yeah, like they get much more like in the smaller towns. I mean, even like you see evidence of that. Like Kent State happens in 1970. That like the idea that like. The campuses that I feel like Kent State would be a campus not unlike the one you went to in Connecticut. Yeah, like kind of like a similar population, similar kind of school.
And I could be wrong, but I remember seeing some kind of like old newspaper report where Central Connecticut State got their SDS chapter like in 1970 or 71.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, when the story is supposedly over.
Yeah, right. And I mean, yes, it's over to a certain extent because it was unfortunate that this generation of leaders. Just kind of go off in a crazy direction. Right. Whether it's, adopting a more countercultural lifestyle or going to the Weather Underground.
Just going to graduate school.
Or going to graduate school, becoming academics. They can't kind of work things out at a national level. But it's not the end of the story. There are all these local chapters, whether it's people of the new left or the old left, who are continue to do work. And they're the ones who are continuing to put pressure on the Nixon administration to bring the war to an end in Vietnam. And so that's when you're only focusing on New York and Berkeley and even Madison.
And the kind of national revolutionary project, right? Yeah. That instead of like looking at like the smaller projects that were happening all around the country that were not only making changes, but pressuring the Nixon administration in a way that like, I don't know, I used to feel like it was a debate whether or not the anti-war movement had an impact. But I feel like if you look at the Nixon administration, like Nixon was terrified of the anti-war movement and thought of them. It's actually trippy to me that like Nixon thought of the anti-war movement as a constituency that he had to react to and had to he had to build his politics in a way that would satisfy them or trick them or whatever. He felt that they were someone he had to answer to. Whereas, like, I don't feel like Obama felt like there was, or Trump. It feels like there's an anti-war movement or even a left.
I mean, we'll see with Trump.
That he has to like react to. That he's there every day. I mean, I think he's talking about, if there's one thing that's common with him and Nixon, is that Trump is talking about the media a lot and is like very paranoid about the media, and he sees that as kind of like his main enemy. But yeah, the anti-war movement in the 60s and into the early 70s is really when they're making a lot of they have a lot of power, but it's not power that people see.
Well, I think what often gets lost when looking at the anti-war movement, and the question is, did they succeed in ending the war in Vietnam? And in my opinion, is yes.
Yeah.
They did end the war in Vietnam, but they did not end militarism.
Right.
And so that's something I think people of an older generation, or even people in our generation too, struggle with.
Yep.
Because that's kind of a difficult conclusion to come to. That, yes, the anti-war movement wasn't the only factor, but it was a big factor in ending the war in Vietnam.
Yep.
But it did not completely change, American foreign policy.
Right.
So there's victories there. Similar to like when you look at the civil rights movement at that time period. I feel like people have a slightly easier time of accepting that. The complicated, question of what did they get in the 60s and 70s. Whereas the anti-war movement, especially when you focus it on the movement at the national level, it's either super romanticized, saying, yes, we ended the war in Vietnam,
right,
and we won.
Yep.
Or no, we completely failed.
No effect whatsoever.
Look at what happened: Reagan, Bush, Obama, drones, and we completely failed.
And having,
of course, the answer is in between.
Yeah, exactly. And having interviewed so many people from this era, they fall into those two camps. One it totally like kind of self-aggrandizing, like we stopped the war, and people need to know that. And then others that feel like we didn't do anything, we didn't create any lasting institutions, we were total failure, and we fought amongst ourselves. A lot of people that like are from the earlier era actually that think that way. I feel like there is just talking to you right now. There's something important about that kind of like post 68 moment. I mean, was it it's come up on this show before about like Penny Lewis's Hard Hats, Hippies, and Hawks. Yeah, she talks a lot. She was one of those. She has a great bit in like the introduction of her book. And she's a sociologist, and she talks about labor a lot, but like she just kind of like makes the case that like the post 68 period is really, really important. Yeah. Oh,
I agree. And so I think what we're kind of dancing around here is that both you and I have read a lot of these memoirs from the 60s.
Right.
Some of them are great.
Yeah.
Some are not so great. But they're fun to read. But I think the literature from that time period, or the scholarship from that time period, is just too tied to memoirs and personal reflections.
Sure.
And so that's where you get these kind of, simplistic conclusions about whatever the 60s or 70s mean, in 2017. And I think you see a similar thing with Nixon.
Yeah.
Nixon, the first wave of scholarship is born out of Watergate. Mm-hmm. And so Nixon is the cartoon character. Nixon is the guy in Futurama, because, and so Nixon is this real, villainous figure who's really trying to do real damage to the country. And then starting in the late 80s and 90s, what you start to notice is a new wave of books that start to take a more quote-unquote nuanced take on Nixon. But it's mostly these baby boomers who are disillusioned by the Reagan administration.
And they're like, is this the school of thought that's like Nixon was the last liberal?
Yes.
And Michael Moore indulges in that.
Yeah. A lot of people do.
They romanticize Nixon and say, well, actually, he created the EPA
and so Nixon becomes
talking points.
And so Nixon becomes this figure that you can use to really argue against whoever your political opponent is.
Right.
And that starts to happen towards the end of the 80s, and it escalates after Nixon's death in 94. Hunter S. Thompson has that famous essay where he's just trashing Nixon weeks after he dies.
Literally trashing him, because if I'm recalling the essay you're talking about, it's Hunter S. Thompson talking about how like the only dignified thing to do in this case is like to like throw Nixon's body in a dumpster.
Oh yeah. But he's the exception. And the reason he's writing that is he's writing against this wave of essays that are coming out and even books where people are saying, well, maybe we were too harsh on Nixon. Yeah. Nixon did go to China. He made a more peaceful relationship with China and the United States. He created the EPA, like as I mentioned before, that's a complicated story.
Mm-hmm.
But, compared to Reagan, who's this vicious conservative who, ended the New Deal era in American
Drained
politics.
the swamp for good. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then Bill Clinton is this Republican light figure in American politics. You could see why these baby boomers are starting to really become attracted to this narrative.
Yeah.
Where they're giving Nixon a second chance.
Mm-hmm.
What complicates this is Stanley Cutler, a great historian of Watergate, a great Nixon historian. He successfully pressures the National Archives to release the Nixon tapes. Up until the mid to late 90s, we only had transcripts of the tapes. And through his work and his efforts, the tapes start to come out in the late 90s. Nice. And more tapes start to come out in the new millennium. When I was at the Nixon Library, we really kind of, my boss there, Tim Naftali, really picked up the pace, releasing the tapes. And you listen to the tapes, and granted, it's not, the Nixon you see in Futurama, but it's pretty close.
Sometimes it is, yeah. I was going to say, sometimes it is.
There are plenty of moments where Nixon is that cartoon figure.
Yeah, right.
And so it kind of you'll notice that a lot of these books, and some of them have come out even in the last year or two. Evan Thomas's book Being Nixon is this very kind of nuanced take on Nixon, where Watergate's only the product of his awkwardness. Yeah, that he was too shy to confront his advisors.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of that mythology about Nixon. Like you talked about, like the kind of like him as this kind of like pathetic salesman.
Yeah.
There's almost like a pity for Nixon that people feel that like, it's like, don't pity this guy.
I mean, in this one book,
don't fall into that trap. Yeah.
And so Evan Thomas's book is the most recent example of this, but there are others that you can easily look up online where it's often tied to the author's own personal narrative.
Yes.
And so Evan Thomas, who is this liberal media establishment figure, worked for Newsweek. He starts. He has an anecdote in his book where he meets Nixon during this party, this media establishment party.
Sure.
And he is fully aware that he was seen as the enemy of Nixon, and that Nixon is friendly to him.
Yeah.
He brings up the fact that his grandfather was Norman Thomas.
Mm.
And so he has this anecdote where Nixon is nice to him. And then he said, it's
and that's enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was nice to me for 5 minutes at a party, and it made me rethink the entire politics and history of the last 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to simplify my critique of the book, but that's kind of at the heart of not only his book, but a lot of Nixon.
It's all psychobiography. I feel like a big part of the historiography about Nixon is just entirely about like his childhood and about his relationship to Bebe Rebozo and was all that kind of stuff comes up a lot. I mean, Oliver Stone is guilty of this.
Oh yeah.
I mean, more than any other like popular filmmaker, or I wouldn't even call him a historian, although he does that like documentary of the United States thing.
And I've seen a few.
Yeah, but he thinks of himself as a historian, and like he's totally personally invested in it, and like that. If you remember, and it really like stuck with me. And tells you the power of this shit, because there's a scene in Nixon where like Anthony Hopkins is looking up at JFK's painting and he says like, oh, they look at you and they see who they want to be, and they look at me and they see who they are.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's so clever. I remember thinking when I was a kid, I was like, it's so clever. Did he really say that? And it's like, probably not. But I mean, I get what he was going for. The like idea of because certainly like Nixon compared himself to Kennedy a lot, and that stuff is fascinating. But it really, really, really kind of oversteps whatever history is supposed to be and turns it into like this Shakespearean drama. I know it's hard not to do that with a person like Nixon.
And it's tied within Oliver Stone's own like personal view
of
the deep state. Yep. In that movie, you see Nixon like clashing with the deep state.
Yeah.
You see Nixon encountering the anti-war movement, and there's an anti-war it's based on a real event where I mean it's been publicized now, where at 4 a.m. he goes to Lincoln Memorial, and it once again it shows just how exceptional Nixon is.
Yeah.
And we actually at the Nixon Library, when I worked there, we found like one of the guys who actually met Nixon. Wow. It was a fascinating interview. But in the real life version, Nixon, has this conversation. It's really weird. And in the Oliver Stone version, one of the hippie protesters, she says to Nixon, "You can't end the war even if you wanted to." And it's basically like saying like the deep state is way too powerful.
Right.
And like, yes, that's probably true to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that. And also, there wasn't a protester who made that argument.
Right.
And so the fact that Oliver Stone created this character. It's
Yep.
basically him talking to Nixon.
Yeah, 100%. Totally.
So once again, his view of Nixon is tied to his own experience of the 1960s and 70s, where at first he vilified Nixon, but now he's like, oh, Nixon's not the real villain. And you can come to that own conclusion, but it shapes the scholarship of the period.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's weird that you have these liberal media establishment figures who want to kind of forgive Nixon and give him a second chance. And in some ways, they're working alongside Nixon loyalists who are also taking on this very kind of conspiratorial view of Watergate,
100%,
where they believe that the CIA brought down Nixon, and that John Dean and Bob Woodward, they were all part of the CIA coup to bring down Nixon. They're all working alongside together.
Well, wasn't Deep Throat the director of the FBI?
Yeah. And so they'll point to these people and they'll say, well, Deep Throat, Mark Felt.
Yep.
He did not like Nixon, so that shows that Watergate was just a product of it was basically a deep
witch
state
hunt.
coup.
Yeah, deep state witch hunt.
That's part of it, but it's not the only thing.
Right.
And so once again, if you listen to the tapes, you can see there's real criminality there. If you look at these stories of people resisting Nixon behind the scenes, there are people who are really bothered by his authoritarian instincts.
Yeah. Well,
and so you can argue both things, that Nixon fits alongside this post-war imperial presidency, but at the same time, he's an exceptional figure. And so if you don't fully confront that exceptional figure in American history, then any president can be rehabilitated.
Yeah.
You can imagine 20 years...
Well, we're seeing that with George Bush right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so because you have these lazy revisionist takes on Nixon, that opens the door to any president.
We're going to have... Don't you think that the next 5 years you're going to see a lot of books and a lot of things, articles in the New York Times that are like a reconsideration of George W. Bush and how smart he was, what a great statesman he was. I mean, it's going to go on and on.
Oh, we can see it with Donald Trump 20 or 30 years from now.
Yes, right, 100%.
Imagine if Trump has, one or two vaguely liberal domestic accomplishments.
Yep.
And 20 years from now, Ted Nugent is president. I mean, I'm being facetious. But, you can totally see, I mean, hopefully this doesn't happen, but you could totally see how, liberal media establishment figures would say, let's take a second look at the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency. It wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about, fascism. There was also some interesting stuff there too.
Oh, God. Well,
and so that's my argument, is that whether or not you agree that Nixon is, the worst post-Cold War president, you still have to acknowledge the exceptional aspects of his presidency.
Yeah.
And so I guess to get back to my biography, when I my next step at grad school was I went to UC Irvine, and I continued to look at the anti-war movement. But while I was there, as a part of a Cold War seminar class that I took, we did a field trip to the Nixon Library.
In Yorba Linda?
In Yorba Linda. Yeah. So it's right in heart of Orange County.
Yeah.
Orange County is a county that's changing quite a bit. It's
right.
becoming more diverse ideologically, racially. But Yorba Linda is still kind of that like old-fashioned, hard right Orange County town, and it's also the birthplace of Richard Nixon, and that's where the Nixon Library is housed. So we took this field trip to the Nixon Library, and the director at that time, Tim Naftali, took our class for a tour, and he also said, "Hey, we're going to be hiring interns for the summer." I thought that'd be an interesting project because their goal was to take this former private presidential librry. It had been absorbed into the federal presidential library system in 2007, and they wanted to create a more nonpartisan museum and a more nonpartisan school tour program. And I said, well, that would be a fun summer thing to do, maybe it could turn into a paid internship. It didn't, but what it did turn into after working for free for about 6 months was it turned into a permanent job.
Nice.
And so while working at the Nixon Library for 3 years as an assistant to the director, I really saw these people trying to rehabilitate Nixon.
Trying to secure a very specific kind of legacy.
And it was a weird alliance between, like I said, liberal scholars and hardcore right-wing conservatives in Yorba Linda. People further to the right of Nixon. People who saw him as a martyr for the cause.
God, Jesus.
So I confronted...
The whole politics of presidential libraries is amazing.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And so the Nixon Library, when I worked there, it was an exceptional time because the Archivist of the United States, who appointed Tim Naftali, who's a Cold War historian, was interested in using... I mean, from what I can gather, he was interested in using the Nixon Library as a test case to see, all right, like... Nixon, of course, is an exceptional figure. He's the only president to resign in American history.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we can do a real Watergate exhibit here.
Right. Yeah.
And that kind of clashed with the fact that most presidential libraries are more interested in creating a positive relationship with presidential families and presidential foundations than they are with real history.
So it's like hagiography, basically. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Especially when a library first opens up.
Yeah.
And you can see this with, the George W. Bush Library, the Clinton Library, and you'll probably see with the Obama Library.
Rick Perlstein had a great piece in the Baffler last year about the becoming Obama Library in Chicago, which is essentially like gentrifying a whole like lower class black neighborhood.
What the Obama
Chicago
Foundation decided to do is kind of the lesser of two evils, and I guess it's the better decision when you're not interested in doing real history.
Yeah,
these presidential libraries take taxpayer dollars to fund the place.
Yeah,
it's the deals vary, but these are private public partnerships. So you have at least a portion of the libraries being funded by your taxpayer dollars. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the argument that the director at the Nixon Library, Tim Naftali, made was, hey, if we're taking taxpayer dollars, then we should do real history.
Yeah.
We should do something close to textbook
of course.
history.
Right. But instead, we're going to take taxpayer dollars and build basically like a palace to a personality.
Exactly. And that's what's often done within the presidential library system.
Yeah.
The Obama Foundation recently announced that they're going to separate the Obama Archive, which will be funded by the National Archives, will be funded by taxpayer dollars.
That's right.
From the Obama Museum. And so they took a look at the presidential library system.
He's going to fund it privately, in other words.
He's going to fund it privately so they can do whatever they want and feel a little less dirty about it. I guess. It's still, for someone who tried, to work alongside people in the National Archives to spread the message of we can do real history here.
Yeah.
We could take government money and create real educational centers.
Doesn't sound like anything anyone wants to do.
No. And so the Obama Foundation decided they don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's the lesser of two evils because at least they're not going to be taking taxpayer dollars to, spread, a pro-Obama narrative.
Right. So wait, so were you in grad school while you were working at the Nixon Library? So that seems like that explains a lot about how you ended up studying Nixon.
Yes. So my third year in grad school, I was encouraged by both my advisor and people at the Nixon Library, because I would have conversations with them about these people that I was doing research on the Republicans who had known Nixon. And they said, hey, there's a dissertation there.
Yeah.
You can return to your anti-war stuff later, but I think there's an interesting dissertation there.
Well, it is kind of it's roundabout. It's That's what I always want to get at with historians. Like, what are you really up to?
Yeah.
Because like it isn't to me. It's like you've found a hole in the scholarship for sure. But it's not just about that. What part of what you're revealing, I think, is something really important about how politics works.
And I think, looking back, I think some of my coworkers, and I'll include myself in this, I think we felt a kinship with some of these Republicans in the Nixon administration who felt like they were being forced to do certain things, would stand up to certain things.
Right.
I think we felt a kinship to them because we were in the National Archives system.
Yep.
Our bosses in D.C. were constantly encouraging us to work peacefully with the Nixon Foundation, moderate the Watergate exhibit that was being created. And I think we kind of, saw ourselves in these stories.
Well, how do you maintain a kind of consistent ethics within an institution that doesn't have one and is sometimes asking you to do things that might contradict that ethical system?
Yeah, and so it was interesting. Someone who, worked alongside, radicals both in academia and in student activism to then work in the National Archives.
Yeah, no, that's great.
It was really interesting. And it was also a valuable lesson in terms of, how public history works.
Yeah.
Well, especially when the public is paying attention.
Well, those lessons, from working on the exhibit at the New York Historical Society on Vietnam with a board of trustees that has Henry Kissinger on it. I mean, it's the delicacies, to put it lightly, of doing public history. It's really, really hard. But I just want to thank you for joining me, Mike. I want to toot our own horns because we're both historians of this era, the 60s, 70s. I think we both think is really important. But we're also people that aren't invested in it personally in quite the same way because we didn't live through it, right? And it's kind of exciting to be part of a generation of historians that are not that didn't live through the era.
Yeah, and one can only hope that the scholarship improves.
Yeah, right.
And fills some of those holes that are left behind by, the baby boomers who I think are just, whether they were inside of the new left or outside of it, or even conservatives, I think they're just too emotionally tied to their own personal memories of that time period.
Well, it's fun to unpack all that stuff with you. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate
it. All right,
it.
Thanks.
Okay, that is it for this episode. I want to thank my guest, Mike Koncewicz. I had a great time talking about Nixon and the politics of the 70s. So much stuff that connects to today in ways that are so much more complicated than I think the most mainstream politics or political writing tends to recognize. So I had a great time. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. You can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. And if you subscribe to the show, please know that you are contributing to growing a left-wing academic biographical historical podcast on the West Coast, which is where I'm headed this summer. So thanks again. I appreciate you listening, and take care. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.